get this started. So my name is Joshua Warren. We're talking about behavior and specification-driven development in PHP, or yo dog. Heard you like to code, so let's write code that writes code while you code. We do have a smaller group today, so if y'all have any questions, I know that the next thing after this is lunch, so feel free to just kind of throw the questions up as we go along. We're going to cover a lot of information pretty quickly, so if there's something that you just want to ask about, need more info about, just let me know. So about me, my name is Joshua Warren, PHP developer. I've been working with PHP since 1999, back in the PHP 3 days. I like to joke about that logo. I actually pulled that off of the Internet Archive. That's the version that they were using in 1999, and no one could really notice how jagged edged it was because web design back then was not what it is today. So, I'm also founder and CEO. I founded Creativity in 2008. We're a PHP development firm focused on the Magento platform. I've been throwing different employees up in all of my talks. In this case, there's my cat Tink. As a joke, I gave her 1 share in Creativity, and to this day she holds it over my head. So, you can find me online at joshuawarren.com. You can also find me on Twitter at Joshua S. Warren. So if you have any questions that we don't cover during the talk or during the Q&A, I have a contact form on my website. You can reach me on Twitter. Very important. As I said, we're going to be going very quickly today because there's a lot of information here. You can go to JoinDen. That specific URL or that QR code will take you to JoinDen. You can download the slides and go back through some of this stuff later. Also, please rate the talk. I am giving this talk fairly often. It's actually going to be delivered at a local meetup next week. So any feedback you have, please go to JoinDen, leave a comment, rate the talk. That way I can keep improving it. Also, conference organizers do look at JoinDen. They look at the feedback there. They look at the ratings. So by giving me a good rating, you're helping me be able to present this to more conferences. So, a few assumptions before we get started. What you need to know. If you don't know some of these things, you can still kind of follow along and then kind of go back and fill in later. But first of all, we assume you're a PHP developer. Anyone in here not a PHP developer? Okay, good. So, we got that covered. That you're familiar with test-driven development. So, show of hands, who is at least familiar with test-driven development? All right. Who actively uses it every day? Okay, that's about right. Yeah, the best I've ever seen is a room where it was 50-50 of do use it, don't use it. So
he's currently in a refactoring process, so we can do it.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Yeah. Or as I heard during my continuous deployment talk, who has it on their roadmap at least? So there we go. So we're assuming that you're familiar with test-driven development. I would recommend you start with test-driven development, but there are some people that are jumping in straight to behavior-driven development and kind of using that as a way to implement TDD, and that's definitely an option. It will also help if you've at least tried PHP Unit, Selenium, some sort of testing tool, just so you kind of know the basics of testing. But if you don't, again, we can kind of fill in and help you out today. So, behavior-driven development. First up, we're just going to define what it is. It's abbreviated BDD. The B does not stand for beer, no matter what a Brit tells you. I gave a BDD talk with James Cowie, who does a lot of Behat work in the UK, and he loves calling it beer-driven development. So I think that's something that Phil Sturgeon supports as well. So basically, think of BDD as stepping back a level from TDD. You basically step up one level. There's a great graphic here from Bug Huntress. So you may have seen this particular cycle with TDD. You write a failing test, you make the test pass, you refactor. So with BDD, you kind of step up a level, and before you write that failing unit test, you write a failing feature test. And then you go through your TDD cycle to make your behavior test or your feature test pass. And sounds complicated, but we're going to walk through a real example today. TDD is usually generally dealing with functional units, unit testing, kind of at a smaller level, lower level than feature level. BDD, you step back a level and you're considering complete and total features. You're considering units that deliver specific business value. So in BDD, you write feature files in the form of user stories that you test against. And if you're familiar with Agile, you're familiar with user stories, it's literally the exact same thing. It's the same kind of user story. And the cool thing is BDD uses what they call a ubiquitous language. I wish they had picked a simpler term for that. But basically what it means is that you have this language in your features and your user stories that stakeholders, project managers, developers, and even automated tools understand. So it's not XML. It's not something that is very focused on just developers or is just very focused on the business side. It's not Visio flowcharts either. It's something that everyone involved in a project can easily understand. And the best way to demonstrate that is here is a sample feature file. This is when you're doing behavior-driven development, you write a feature file, and you can basically read through it, plain English. The feature name is Laravel test. And you say, in order to demonstrate Laravel and Behat as a user, I need to be able to visit the homepage of a new Laravel app. And then you have a scenario. The scenario is called homepage, and you say, given I am on the homepage, then I should see Laravel 5. The cool thing is, obviously, a business stakeholder can read this and can understand it and say, okay, so this is what's being implemented. A developer can read it and say, okay, this is what I need to do. But then also, as we're going to see in a minute, there are automated tools that actually understand the phrase I'm on the home page and know that they need to navigate to the home page. We do that using Behat. We implement BDD and PHP with a tool called Behat. It's a free open source tool designed for BDD and PHP. Not going to cover too much about it here because we're going to work through a real example with it. If you do want to learn more about it, tons of documentation online at behat.org. Now, the additional layer here with PHPSpec is specification behavior-driven development, which is abbreviated Spec BDD. I call it testing tongue twisters. I wish, again, they had kind of picked a simpler acronym, but it's called Spec BDD. And the idea behind specification behavior-driven development is that before you write a single line of code, you write a specification for how that code should work, what that code should look like. And it's really cool because it forces you to focus in on your architectural decisions up front. So at the Behat level, you're writing kind of the business value, what this feature should do, and then you step down with the PHP spec and say, okay, in order to make that happen, here's the sort of code that I'm going to need to write. We do use a tool called PHPSpec for that, and it's an open source tool for specification-driven development in PHP. Again, you can go to PHPSpec.net. And you're wondering why would you want to do this? You're writing code in PHP, you're using a framework. Why do you want to add more tools? Why do you want to add this additional layer of using Behat and PHPSpec? So you're going to see today how these tools allow you to focus exclusively on logic. Basically, it automates quite a bit of the boilerplate so that you're not having to do it. It allows you to, as a developer, you focus on developing interesting code to solve problems and not necessarily worrying about defining classes and a lot of the kind of bootstrapping code that we spend a lot of time doing. It also helps build functional testing coverage for those of you, basically everyone in the room, that said that they are moving towards TDD. Instead of necessarily having to learn Selenium to learn how to build up functional testing coverage, you can actually use Behat, as you'll see in a little bit, and you can write Behat feature files instead of having to design Selenium test cases. So it's a lot easier way to build up your test coverage. Finally, on the business side of things, I really like Behat and PHPSpec because it helps guide planning, and it basically adds something to your processes that ensures that all your stakeholders are in agreement. I'm sure we've all gotten halfway through a project, got it, implemented, shown it to a client, shown it to a stakeholder, and been told, oh no, that's not what I wanted, that's not what I expected, go redo it all. So this basically helps eliminate that because you're having that conversation, you're writing those feature files together, and you're saying, okay, what should this feature do, and what should it look like when it's done? And then when you're done, you can use Behat to actually prove that it does exactly what you said it was going to do. So that's a lot of theory. Let's actually build something. Let's dive in and see how you can use Behat and PHPSpec. So for this example, I wanted to do something real. I'm actually working on getting this up on GitHub so you can see a full, real, complete working application built with Behat and PHPSpec. So we're going to use Laravel 5 to build an app that tracks how much sleep we've logged with Fitbit and how much sleep debt we have. Thought it was pretty appropriate for this conference since I have not been getting much sleep. So you don't have to use Laravel. You can use Behat and PHPSpec with a homegrown framework. You can use it with Magento, with WordPress. You can use it with anything. I just picked Laravel 5 because I wanted something to get me up and running real quickly with an app and not have to show, a lot of the low-level stuff. So to get started, we set up a project. So follow the normal process for setting up a Laravel project, or if you're using a different framework, follow the process for setting up that framework. Behat and PHPSpec do both use Composer, so you can just use Composer to require to install them. So on this, basically you would do all of this except for the items that specifically mention Laravel if you're working with a different system. And a lot of the other systems like Magento, there's Behat Mage and Mage Spec, and so you'll find that there are platform-specific, framework-specific extensions you can add in. But basically all this does is it pulls in Behat, it pulls in PHPSpec. Behat does use a tool called Mink to actually power the browser-based testing, so that's what that is that's pulling in there. So this just gets these tools installed into our project and lets us get started. So your first step with Behat is you run Behat init, and Behat's going to create a few basic files and folders for you. It'll create a features folder where you actually write your features. Then in our case, since we're using Laravel, we create a file called behat.yaml, and we just point it to Laravel. We say we're using this Laravel extension that supports Behat, so we ask Behat to load that in. Do the same thing for PHPSpec. We just basically create a PHPSpec.yaml that points PHPSpec to the proper places in Laravel. If you are using a different framework, if you just Google for framework and PHPSpec, framework and Behat, you'll find an example for that framework. So we have all kind of the scaffolding in place. We have the basics, the config files, the folders. So the first thing we're going to do with behavior-driven development is we're going to write a feature. We describe a feature in a feature file. So like I said, Behat's going to create a folder called features, and in that folder you can name your feature anything you want. So in this case, since we're doing a Fitbit integration, I named it fitbit.feature. You describe in that feature section what the feature is. So in this case, I named it Fitbit integration, and I said in order to obtain Fitbit data as a user, I need to be able to authenticate with Fitbit. That part, right now, Behat doesn't do a lot with the feature part. That's mainly to document for future developers, for stakeholders, things like that, why you're implementing this feature. The next part is the scenario, and the scenario Behat actually does process and does run. So that part is where you write basically your test case. So in this case, we have a scenario called not yet authenticated. So we say, given I am not logged in as joshcreativity.com, when I go to /Fitbit, then I should see please authenticate. So in your scenarios, you can start them out with given, and that's just a precondition that says this is kind of the starting state for this test. So you will see tests that don't include given. If you have something that just works by default, that doesn't require logging in, anything like that, you can leave given off. Then you say when. So you say what action should be taken. Behat understands I go to means open a web browser, navigate to the base URL of your application plus whatever you put in quotes there. So with this, when you say when I go to Fitbit, Behat's actually going to use Mink, it's going to open a browser, and it's going to navigate to /Fitbit, and it's going to read the results. Then that's your expected result. So then I should see please authenticate. That just means that it's going to use Mink when it's looking through those results. It's going to search for a string called please authenticate. So if it's able to navigate to that page and it sees that text, then your test is going to pass. Now the cool thing is you run Behat. And if you run Behat by itself, it's going to basically throw an error. And it's going to say, hey, you haven't defined what the phrase "I am not logged in as" means. But if you run Behat with the command line option append snippets, Behat will actually write the code for you. So it's processing through the scenario here, and it gets to given I am not logged in as, and it says, wait a second, I don't know what that means. So then here at the bottom, it tells you that you have an undefined step, and it's actually going to update this file to define that step. So Behat's actually written some code for us. It's fairly basic. This is actually what Behat has added. It'll add it into the feature context file, and it's taken I am not logged in as and converted it into a function. Because we passed it something in quotes, it knows that it should accept an argument, and then when it creates a new definition like this, it will always say throw new pending exception. That way if you run Behat again, it knows that this is code that Behat has generated for you that you haven't finished yet. So basically it's written just enough to get us to where we need to add our logic. And then it expects us to add logic to that function that detects if the user is not logged in. And I'll show you that in a second, but first we're going to finish out our feature file. So we have a couple of other features we need to define. So the first scenario is, okay, I've logged in. Let's make sure that login in works correctly. So we have a scenario called I have authenticated. It says given I am logged in as josh@creativity.com. When I go to Fitbit, then I should see welcome back. And then finally, the last step is we need to actually confirm that we're able to pull in the sleep data from Fitbit from their API. So we say scenario, I have sleep data. Given I am logged in as josh@creativity.com, when I go to Fitbit/sleep, then I should see sleep report. So we're going to run Behat again. We're going to use the append snippets command again, and it's going to create two more functions in that file for the other things it needs us to define. So now we're going to fill in that logic that Behat needs us to add. So I take I am not logged in as, and then I just use, kind of did a quick hack here, but I just use a few lines here that are going to make sure that we're just completely logged out. So that way when Behat runs this, when it opens the web browser, the session is going to be completely destroyed, so it will have been logged out. Now this one's a little more complicated just because we are using Laravel. This is the I am logged in as function. This is one thing that is a little tricky about Behat and Laravel, is that you have to remember that you're executing PHP code on the server, but then at the same time Behat is using Mink to open up a web browser to browse to the site, and the two aren't communicating with each other. So you can't just say in this, I'm going to call a function that just logs me in. You can't just log in directly to the PHP app. You're actually having to, in this case, get a cookie, get the session ID, and pass it to Mink so that Mink can use that cookie to authenticate as you. So that's why it's a fairly big chunk of code there that just implements that functionality. Again, the cool thing is if you go out there and you Google for Behat and the name of your framework, you're going to find code like this that people have already written that you can use to speed this up. So we've got these features defined, and we've got all the steps defined. We then run Behat one more time, and here's what we're going to get. It now understands all of the steps. So in this case, this is the bottom of the output, so it's run and shown all three of the features. And it says on this last feature that, okay, it was able to log in, it went to the URL Fitbit/sleep, but the text sleep report was not found anywhere in the text of the current page. And that's because we haven't written any logic yet. We haven't done anything to actually connect to Fitbit. So I call this a perfect failure. That's what we want. That's kind of like with TDD, where you want to start with a failing test. So we have our failing test, we have our starting point. And these failures are showing us that Behat is testing our app properly, and that all we have to do is write the application logic. So writing the application logic. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to write some specifications. Before we start just coding these functions, we're going to specify them. So we write specifications for how the Fitbit class should work. And these specifications should provide the logic to deliver the results that Behat is testing for. So the first thing you do is you run PHPSpec, and there is a command called describe. So you say describe and the name of the class you want to describe. So we're going to create a class named Fitbit to contain all this logic. So we say describe Fitbit. PHPSpec will actually generate the specification file for you. It will get you started kind of like Behat did, so that you don't have to start from scratch. And that specification file will look like this. Every class by default, when you specify it, it will create one function called it is initializable. And it says that it just tests to make sure that when you initialize the class Fitbit, it is of the type Fitbit. So if you had said describe foo, then it would say should have type foo. So it's just testing to make sure that it's testing the correct class. So we need to add a bit more to the file so that PHPSpec understands what the class should do. Because right now it's just testing to make sure the class exists, and that doesn't really help us for making sure that the logic actually works correctly. So now we add a couple of functions to the fitbitspec.php file. And you can call these functions whatever you would like. It helps to make them descriptive names. So in this case, we have a function called it connects to Fitbit, and we have a function called it returns sleep data, because that's the two bits of logic we need to implement to get this application working. The really, really cool thing about PHPSpec is you can generally read the statements as English. So in this case, it's saying that the class Fitbit should have a function called connect. The class connect should accept a parameter called email, and when it accepts a parameter called email, it should return the string success. Same thing with the sleep data function. So this says that we're going to have a function in the Fitbit class called sleep data. It's also going to accept an email address, and when you pass it an email address, it should return, in this case, I just said an array of 8 hours a night because I wish I was getting 8 hours of sleep. So we run PHPSpec once more, and again, we get lots of failures. So it will say, in this case, the very first run, it just says class does not exist, class does not exist, class does not exist. Says that again and again and again. So again, lots of failures. But PHPSpec, at the end of all those failures, is going to prompt us. And it actually says, do you want me to create this class for you? Do you want me to do the work for you? And so, of course, we say yes. And it's really cool because then PHPSpec actually creates the class and the methods for us. So we don't have to write any of the boilerplate to create a class called Fitbit to create each of these functions. PHPSpec will actually go in, write the code for us. And where this really comes in handy is if you're working with a framework like Laravel or Magento, they have PHPSpec plugins so that PHPSpec not only writes the class for you, but it puts it in the right place. So like with Magento, we have a very complex extension setup in Magento 1. You have to put files in about 5 different folders to write an extension. So when you use PHPSpec with Magento and you say, please create this class for me, it goes into all 5 of those locations and it puts all the right code in all the right places to get you started. Even with Laravel, it will put it into the proper location under the app folder for you. And this is the code it generates. So again, it's created a function called connect. It's created a function called sleep data. It already has the parameter there, and then it'll actually even give you a helpful comment that just says write logic here. So again, it's gotten all the bootstrapping done. So now we move on to the easy part, the fun part, implementation. This is where you actually need to implement logic in the new Fitbit class in the locations described by PHPSpec. So literally, after you've defined these feature files, you've defined these specifications, you've used these tools, instead of starting out with, okay, well, I guess I need to create a class. Oh, I think I'll create it over here. You literally just say, I'm going to open up these new files. I'm going to look for anywhere that says write logic here, and I'm going to write the logic. Not going to walk through all of that because this isn't a lesson on Laravel. So I'm just going to say, imagine that we have written the logic and we've tied the logic into some views. So our application now has that logic in those places and we've connected it to some views. So we're done with implementation. So we're going to move on to testing. So not only has Behat and PHPSpec helped us know where we need to write the code, what code we need to write, it also builds test coverage. So you run PHPSpec, which literally it's just PHPSpec run, and it should return green. And what that means is it's gone through and it's tested, it's made sure that the class fitbit exists, it made sure that when it called each of those functions in the class fitbit, they returned the expected data. So then once you get PHPSpec returning green, you know your application logic is good, you run Behat. And that's when Behat is going to use Mink, and it's going to run a web browser, and it's going to actually test the application for you, and that should return green as well now.
Does that run a web browser including JavaScript, or is it just headless?
Depending on, there's a lot of different drivers for Mink, and you can even use Selenium, you can use some of the other JavaScript-based systems. So it all comes down to which driver you're using. So, and it's really cool. Again, there's so much good information and documentation about this out there that if you just search for, if you have like a specific platform you want to test, or system you want to test, or system you want to use, it's amazing how much you can just find on Google. So it's pretty cool. So now when we have run PHPSpec and we've run Behat and it's all returning green, we know that our feature is working correctly, and we never had to open a web browser. It did it all for us. So not only are we not having to spend our time creating class files and creating boilerplate, but we're also not having to go through and actually manually test in the browser each time. And this is really cool as well, because let's say it's a year from now and you've been implementing 2 or 3 features a week, you have 100 features in your application, you don't have time to test those every time you make a change. So as long as you've been continually adding feature files as you go, you've been using BDD, then when you run Behat run, then you will know that the app still works, that you haven't made any changes that broke anything. Additionally, PHPSpec gives us confidence that the application logic was implemented correctly. It's great that in our test cases, the web browser is seeing the expected results, but with PHPSpec, we're stepping down a level and we're saying, not only did we happen to get the correct results in this case, but we should be getting correct results for every case because we've tested our logic and our logic's working correctly. And again, Behat is giving us confidence that the feature is being displayed properly to users. So we know that each time we run Behat, it's returning green. That means our users are also going to see what we expect them to see. And so success. We have a working application. It's running the functions and the integration that we expected it to run. We're getting the results that we expect. So our application is complete and functioning thanks to Behat and PHPSpec. So today I was very much focused on getting you hooked on Behat and PHPSpec and showing you how easy it is to get started. I will say that both Behat and PHPSpec are very powerful tools. There are a lot of advanced use cases for both of these tools. With PHPSpec, you can get much more detailed. You can test on a very granular level to make sure every bit of your application logic works correctly. I didn't show that approach today because I don't want you to get bogged down to think that the only way to use PHPSpec is if you have 100% test coverage down to the smallest function. I think 100% test coverage is great. I think it's not practical though in a lot of cases. So that's why I kind of showed how you can pick and choose what you're testing there. One thing I'd like to see is I would encourage y'all next week, get back home, get back into the swing of things at work. Try using Behat and PHPSpec on one of your projects and take it for just a quick test, implement one short feature. The example I showed earlier with Behat with a feature file that just tests the Laravel homepage, just try that out. And you can see once you've used it once you've kind of gone through the basics of getting the YAML file set up, things like that, it's a lot easier. A lot of people that maybe tried Selenium a few years ago and that scared them off from TDD. Sometimes when I show them Behat and PHPSpec, they say, oh no, it's going to take me a week to get this thing set up and working. It really doesn't. It's really powerful, and they've really focused on making it very easy to get up and running with it. So definitely encourage y'all to do that. Also, keep in touch. If y'all have any questions, again, please rate the talk on Joined In. Please also feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter or on the web, and hopefully y'all have some questions for me. So,
sorry if I lost my voice. The PHP unit, to get more and more tests, it takes longer to run the test.
mm-hmm.
If you get a ton of tests, it bogs the servers down. How have you found PHPSpec works? You get lots of tests.
Spec is great. Behat does, with the overhead of using Mink, opening a web browser, things like that, Behat does slow down, kind of bog down. But PHPSpec, the guys that have written it have really focused on the performance of it. It's kind of, they've looked at a lot of the complaints with PHP unit and said we need to build a newer tool that kind of resolves some of these things. And you can use them side by side. There's definitely some great cases where you use both PHPSpec and PHP unit, but I would say that PHPSpec tends to be a lot faster. So.
I'm guessing the answer is yes to this one, but is PHPSpec integratable with continuous integration tools like Jenkins?
Yes, yeah. And we use Bamboo for our CI setup, and yeah, we will run Behat and we will run PHPSpec with all of that, and then carry it on and tie it into a whole continuous delivery setup. So yeah.
So this is sort of, so PHPSpec do some of the unit testing kind of thing with PHP unit, and then Behat does more functional testing on top, so that spins up the browser.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have an integrated system to do both the functional and your unit testing.
Yes, yeah. And they're the maintainers behind both of them are closely related. Like the two projects are very closely tied together, so you usually find that when one of them adds a feature, the other will usually add a complementary feature. So yeah, it's a good way to get kind of a complete package for testing. So
I've used that Codeception.
okay.
I've used that. I think it's similar, but it's based on PHP unit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you used that as well?
I looked at it, but haven't used it. I kind of went straight from a very PHP unit and Selenium focused setup to Behat and PHPSpec. And a lot of that was with doing a lot of the work with Magento. As soon as they had those extensions for Behat and PHPSpec, that just, cut in half the amount of time it takes to implement this stuff. And most of the other frameworks out there for PHP have those extensions as well, and that really helps. So, yeah.
So with those extensions, ones that generate your classes for you,
Mm-hmm.
you've got all the errors that it offers to create them for you, and it uses those extensions, so you use Magento and knows to put them in those 5 folders. Have you used that with the custom framework and defined your own locations? Have you written that for it?
Have seen people do it, and I have a couple of friends that have done it, but I myself haven't done it. So
Pretty intense, or is it?
it's honestly not too bad, because for the most part it's just saying here's the pattern for what folders you need to create, here's the pattern for what folders need to be added, that sort of thing. And it's the great thing is it's all open source, so you can go out there and you can look at the Laravel extension, you can look at the Magento extension, fork it and tweak it for your custom framework.
Okay.
So that definitely helps. So
Are a lot of frameworks or any frameworks using this for their test suites?
I have seen talk of it. I haven't seen if anyone's actually started doing it yet. So I know a lot of people are wanting frameworks themselves to move into kind of using this as how they even develop the framework. But it's one of those things. The framework authors are just like us freelancers and us developers and development agencies. There's never enough hours in the day. So I think it's on the roadmap in a lot of cases. So.
More and more have good test coverage like Laravel.
Yeah.
Laravel, for instance, is using PHP.
Yeah. So it's one of the reasons why I like talking about Behat and PHPSpec too, because a lot of developers just aren't aware of it yet. And as we make more and more people aware of it, you're going to see more frameworks using it. So because when you sit down, you say, okay, I'm writing a new framework or I'm writing a new app. When you use test-driven development, I know PHP unit, so I'm going to use PHP unit. They don't even realize that there's some newer tools out there. So.
Does this have a whole data fixture?
Yes, yeah. You can do all sorts of fixtures. It supports mocking. It's...
Mocking file system.
Yeah. So I didn't want to dive too deep into it, but yeah, it's when I say it's powerful and there's some advanced tools with it, it's very advanced. So. Cool. Anything else? All right. Well, thank y'all very much.